evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to Science for Peace and Extinction for Rebellion for providing this opportunity to me tonight to talk to you about the problem of military emissions, the problem of military expenditures, and then I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about the hope for disarmament, conversion, and peace, and then I'll end with sharing some ideas for action and some resources. So my presentation is about 30 minutes. I'm just showing you a very brief sketch of the research that I'm doing for my PhD, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, the question and comments afterwards. But I would like to begin by just providing some context and some of the latest science. So as you're aware, over the past few months, this fall, there have been several important scientific reports that have come out. So in September, just before the UN Climate Summit took place, there was the United in Science report. This is a report that was co-authored by a number of organizations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, and in that report, they stressed that meeting the Paris Agreement requires immediate and all-inclusive action encompassing deep decarbonization. There was also the production gap report and the emission gap report, and in those reports, they emphasized that Canada is not on track. The Western countries, we are not on track to meet our Paris Agreement. The United in Science report and the emissions gap report also talked about the increase of carbon emissions over the past few years, an increase of 2%, so that last year the annual global carbon emissions in gigatons was approximately 55 gigatons of CO2, and that the carbon budget that's remaining is between 420 and 570 gigatons, giving us approximately 8 to 10 years. Now, I also want to highlight some of the key principles that are in the Paris Agreement. These are principles that have been articulated in many IPCC reports, but they are very important in this climate science context. And these are the principles of transparency in how emissions are reported, accountability for those emissions, the idea of equity, something that Greta often mentions, justice, just transition, and sustainable development. So it's this climate science and these principles that need to be guiding the policy decisions and the actions that our government and that we are taking in trying to deal with this climate emergency. So now let's talk about military emissions. In June of this year, the Costs of War Project at Brown University released a really important study. It's one of the first, looking at the fuel consumption of the Pentagon and the carbon emissions of the US military. And what they found in this report, they looked at the fuel consumption public records from the Defense Logistics Agency. This is the agency in the Pentagon that does all of the buying of the fuel and the equipment that the US military needs. And what they determined is that since the global war on terror started in 2001, over the past 18 years, that the US military has used approximately, to fight its wars, 1.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's about 1 gigaton. They also said that the annual Pentagon fuel use is equivalent to a medium-sized country. So the US military is using as much fuel and burning as much emissions as the country of Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. But think for a moment that the US military, the troop size is only 2 million people, and they have this huge carbon blueprint, whereas a country of Sweden has a population of 10 million people, Denmark and Finland, a population about 5 million people. So the size of the carbon blueprint of the United States military is very, very big. They also, in that report, talked about the fuel consumption and the inefficiency of military vehicles. So I would just like to note two of them here for you. So a B-2 bomber has an internal fuel capacity of 25,000 gallons of fuel. And notice how far it can go. It's 4.2 gallons a mile. So military vehicles, the rate is changed. Instead of going miles per gallons, because military vehicles are so inefficient, it's gallons per mile. So it does not go very far with this amount of fuel. And then notice here, it says KC-46A. These are refuelers. These are aircraft that fly alongside bombers and fighter jets to refuel because they burn so much fuel. And these refuelers also have 16,000 gallons internal capacity. They burn a lot. They don't go very far on the amount of fuel that they have. Now, I just want to read a part of this report, and I want you to imagine for a moment the fuel consumption and the carbon emissions of this one operation. A B-2 bomber on a mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri might be refueled many times. For example, on the 18th of January 2017, two B-2 bombers, accompanied KC-135 and KC aerial refueling tankers, made a 30-hour round-trip mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to Libya to drop bombs on ISIS targets and flew back. This is a picture of the refueling of a Canadian fighter jet, a CF-18. Now, fighter jets and bombers use a specialized fuel called JP-8, and this fuel is more highly refined and toxic than the fuel that's used by commercial aircraft because of the burn rate and because of the specialized engine. Fighter jets also are usually manned by 1 to 2 pilots, and they are carrying munitions, right? A dozen munitions. So unlike commercial aircraft that will have, a pilot and a couple of co-pilots, and they're carrying people that are 200, 300, 400 passengers that are going to visit family or going to work, and they're carrying all this luggage. Fighter jets are carrying pilots, and they're carrying bombs, and they're burning a lot of fuel for this. So Canada used these CF-18 fighter jets in an operation called Operation Impact over the past 5 years. I should also mention that these Canadian fighter jets have an internal fuel capacity of about 14,400 pounds of fuel. They also cost between $10,000 and $17,000 an hour to operate or maintain. So for 5 hours of operating these Canadian fighter jets, this is the salary of a nurse or of a teacher in this province. Now, these are the fighter jets that Canada used to bomb Syria and Iraq from October 2014 to February 2016. And then we stopped doing the bombing in February 2016, but we did the refueling of all of the US-led coalition airstrikes until January of 2019. Now, this Operation Impact is the Canadian contribution to a broader US-led coalition operation called Operation Inherent Resolve. And it is the mission to defeat and destroy ISIS in the Middle East. And for the past 5 years, the US-led coalition, including Canada, has dropped about 120,000 bombs on these two countries in the last 60 months. And there has been 35,000 airstrikes, about 120,000 bombs, and Air Wars, a consortium of independent journalists, think that there have been up to between 7,000 and 11,000 innocent civilians that have been killed from this operation. This is from the Department of National Defense website. giving a bit more information about this operation impact. So I'll just point to you here, and it says that Canadian Polaris refuelers have been doing the refueling of the US-led coalition airstrikes, and these Canadian refuelers have been flying for 7,000 hours. They have delivered 65 million pounds of fuel to coalition forces for these airstrikes. Okay? So just keep those statistics in your mind for a moment. This was posted by the Canadian Armed Forces social media Twitter account, and it shows that not only have we contributed fighter jets and refuelers to this mission in the Middle East, we have also been supplying these massive aircraft, these Hercules, that help to transport soldiers and equipment and weapons to this mission as well. So it talks about the fact that there have been 2,000 missions of these Hercules aircraft, and there have been 12 million pounds of cargo. So this is an extremely carbon-intensive mission, okay? So I wrote to the Minister of National Defense, and I asked Minister Sajjan, are you calculating the carbon emissions of this very intensive operation? And he said no. The Department of National Defense is not estimating or calculating the greenhouse gas emission or climate impacts from Operation Impact. So let me just tell you briefly some information about the climate impacts of the military. So we know from the report from the Cost of War Project at Brown University and many congressional reports, and even from the White House document, Obama's 2013 Climate Action Plan, that the U.S. military is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. It's not only the largest consumer of fossil fuels, but it is also the largest landholder on the planet. In Canada, the Department of National Defense is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels, and it's also the largest landholder in the country. And the way that the military uses fuel is to power their operations, their vehicles. So 75% of their fuel is called operational energy. It's for them to move their troops around and their weapons around. And 25% of it is stationary operations. Among all the different branches of the military, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and cyber, it's the Air Force that uses the most petroleum products. And military vehicles like fighter jets, light armored vehicles, warships, they are notoriously energy inefficient, as I showed you. They have long life cycles, 30 to 40 years, and they have locked-in energy platforms that are very difficult, nearly impossible to try to retrofit with renewable energy. Now, the military is concerned about its fuel costs because it's very high, and it's concerned about its energy security. This is why the military is engaged in so many wars for oil, because it wants to secure access to petroleum because it's powered by petroleum. But the military is not concerned about its carbon impacts. This is very clear from the documents. It is concerned about about climate impacts and the threat multiplier effect from climate change, but they use it as a justification for their continued existence. There's going to be climate chaos, so we're going to need a robust military. Now, accounting for military emissions is not transparent. There are many exemptions for confidentiality, for aggregation, in the greenhouse gas inventories that make it very difficult for us to assess really the extent of the military's fuel consumption and carbon impacts. And military emissions are also exempted from the national reduction targets. So how is this operationalized, and where does this come from? Well, this is all derived from the Kyoto Protocol that was negotiated in the mid-1990s. And it derives from the exemption to international bunker fuels for international aviation and shipping and multilateral operations. And so this exemption for bunker fuels became part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's guidelines for the crafting of the national greenhouse gas inventory. So this is the reporting template that all countries use to do their inventories that are submitted to the that are submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, I want to read you this quote. This is from Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the lead negotiator on the American delegation at the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in the mid-1990s. And this helps to explain why the military has been given these provisions, these exemptions and these exclusions. So I will read this whole quote. This is a quote that he gave in front of the Senate, this testimony in February of 1998. We took special pains working with the Defense Department and with our uniformed military, both before and in Kyoto, to fully protect the unique position of the United States as the world's only superpower with global military responsibilities. At Kyoto, the parties, for example, took a decision to exempt key overseas military activities from any emissions targets, including exemptions for bunker fuels used in international aviation and maritime transport, and from emissions resulting from multilateral operations. Now, the Paris Agreement of 2015 does not rectify any of this. And this is evident from the latest greenhouse gas inventories from the US government. If you look at that document, they say very clearly emissions from international bunker fuels, including emissions from civilian and military activities, are not included in the transportation totals. They're not included in the inventory for the United States, and they're not included in their reduction target. Now, you know with the Paris Agreement, every country can determine their own plan to reduce their emissions under the nationally determined contributions. And Canada and the United States have made the decision to exempt their militaries. This is also evident in Canada if you were to look at the very first environmental and energy strategy from the Department of National Defense. So this came out in November of 2017. And if you look at that very short report, you will see there it says, given the unpredictable changes in operational tempo, the federal reduction target for Canada will not include emissions from military activities and operations. Now, I have filed many access to information to try to get information about the Canadian military's fuel consumption and carbon emissions, because this is not publicly available. And actually, in the United States, a little bit more information is made public than in Canada. But I'll just show you this one slide from the ATI, the Access to Information records, and this shows the fuel consumption of the Canadian military. So if you look at this pie chart here, you can see that most of the fuel used by the military is aviation fuel. This is the specialized fuel, JPA. Then there's diesel fuel, gasoline, ship fuel, natural gas, heavy oil, and there's some coal, and then there's a little bit, 15% for electricity, and there's some hydropower. Okay, so you can see that it reflects that ratio. About 75% of military fuel use is petroleum to power its vehicles and its operations. So I also wrote to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, at the time this was Catherine McKenna, to confirm with her, is it true that the Canadian military is exempted from the national reduction target? And she said yes. So I'll read this quote. Certain emissions of greenhouse gases are excluded from the federal reduction target because of their important role in ensuring the national safety and security of all Canadians. This includes the operation of the military vehicles and equipment by national defense, and she also mentioned that D&D is one of the largest landholders and the largest energy consumer in the government of Canada. Now, some of you might have seen this chart. Who's aware of the greening government strategy in Treasury Board in the federal government? Is anybody aware of this? So you can go and you can have a look at their website, and you will see this chart, and you might think to yourself, oh, well, but they are telling us what the Department of National Defense carbon emissions are, and they're showing all of the other federal departments what their carbon emissions are. But the only thing that they're showing, the only thing that they've scoped in, that they're really paying attention to, is that small 25%, is that stationary energy, is the energy that's used by their buildings in Canada. So you can see, just to confirm, the green here is facilities, and fleets is that gray bit right there. But the fleets that they are looking at in national defense are only their commercial fleet, is their non-military vehicles. These are the fancy cars that they drive around the generals in. Like if you've ever gone to a base and you see the Rolls Royce that drives through. So it's those non-military commercial fleets. So yeah, it's vehicles that are not military. So that's what that gray chart is. So actually, if you were to add that other 75%, it would be off the charts here. It would just be huge. Okay. So the military, the Canadian military, the U.S. military, these are institutions that are under the control of the government. They are our public institutions. The military, if you think about it, is an institution that is based on force, it's based on coercion, it's based on violence. This is an institution that consumes a tremendous amount of petroleum products. And we as a public and our government are choosing to allow the military to use so much petroleum product for its vehicles and for its operations. So this is a huge problem. Now I'd like to talk briefly about another aspect of this, and this is the problem of military expenditures. Not only is the military using a lot of fossil fuels, it's also using a lot of our public finances. So according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, their latest study on global military spending for this past year, they showed that global military spending has increased to $1.8 trillion. There is intense pressure by NATO and by the United States for Canada to increase military spending. Canada and all of the other NATO members, there's 29 NATO members, made a commitment in 2014 at the Wales Summit to increase military spending to 2% of GDP by 2024. And of that 2% of GDP, 20% is going to be to buy more equipment to modernize and upgrade the military. So there's constant pressure to get new fighter jets, new armored vehicles, new warships to stay current and interoperable with our allies. Among all NATO members, Canada, on a cash basis, is 6th highest in military spending. And in the world, among all 193 countries on the planet, Canada is ranked 14th highest for military spending. In the news, you often hear Canada isn't spending enough on the military. Canada is only spending 1.3% of GDP on the military. This isn't enough. Well, actually, we are spending way too much on the military, and I'll show you the figures in a moment. The other thing that you need to know is, if you recall from 2006, the Stern report on the economics of climate change, the 2% of GDP is what is needed to attend to the climate emergency. And instead, there's intense pressure for us to spend that on the military. So let's look a little bit more closely at military spending. So this is from the CIPRI report. The top military spender is no surprise, the United States. This is for 2018. This is just looking at the Department of National Defense, just the base amount for defense, $649 billion. Next, China, $250 billion. Saudi Arabia, $67 billion. India, $66 billion. France, $63 billion. There's Russia, sixth, at $61 billion. This is 1/10 what the United States is spending on the military, but you're constantly hearing in the media that Russia is our adversary. This is not the case. In fact, over the past several years, Russia has decreased military spending to invest more in their social programs. United Kingdom, $50 billion, then you keep scrolling your finger down, and then you see Canada at $21 billion. Now, this is just the base amount, and this is in US dollars. We're going to look more carefully at military spending in a moment. But I just want to go back to the spring and to this announcement that Trump made about proposing his budget. He said, this was the headline, Trump 2020 budget includes a funding boost for the military and border wall and cuts everywhere else. So there is going to be a 5% increase to the Pentagon budget and the deepest cuts in U.S. history to domestic programs, Medicaid, food stamps, clean energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, let's look at defense spending versus the Environmental Protection Agency spending. So this is from the Office of Management and Budget in the United States. And you can see, there it is, for 2018, $656 billion for the Department of Defense. And then the Environmental Protection Agency's budget was just $8 billion. And that's the budget that Trump is going to slash by 30%. Now, the thing that I did is I tracked through the archives of the Office of Management and Budget, tracked the EPA spending versus the DO spending over the past 20 years. And you can see that spending for the Department of Defense has gone up like that to $656 billion, and that the EPA's budget has effectively flatlined between about $6 and $8 billion over the past 20 years, even though the ecological and the climate crisis has gotten much worse these past 2 decades. The Government Accountability Agency in the United States releases this report called the High Risk List every 2 years. And so this past spring, they have released their High Risk List report, and the Department of Defense is at the top of this list. So this is a list where the GAO is concerned that it's a department or agency that's at a risk for fraud, abuse, and waste. And this is a direct quote from that report. The Department of Defense remains one of the few federal entities that cannot account accurately for and report on its spending or its assets. DoD's discretionary spending makes up about half the federal government's discretionary spending, and its assets represent more than 70% of the federal government's physical assets. Can you imagine, folks, this amount of money going to a federal department where there is no oversight and there is no independent accounting? Okay, so let's talk now about Canadian military spending. Now, I also did the same chart comparing and contrasting as I did with the United States, national defense spending in Canada with the Department on Environment and Climate Change, and you can see the ratio is about the same. The other thing that I did is I went through the archives of the public accounts of Canada to track spending for the Department of National Defense over the past 20 years from $8 billion in 1997 to last year, $32 billion. In 1997, Department of Environment was about $600 million, and last year it was $1.8 billion. So we are spending very little money for the principal department that is responsible for protecting the natural environment and climate change. Okay, but you might have heard about this plan that came out in December of 2016. This is Canada's climate change plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And in that plan, they identify about $132 billion of new spending at the provincial and the federal level for climate adaptation and mitigation over the next 11 years for all these programs. Let's contrast that with the military. So, 6 months after the Pan-Canadian Framework came out, our Minister of Global Affairs, of Foreign Affairs at the time, Chrystia Freeland, stood up in the House of Commons June 2017 and announced Canada's new foreign policy priorities. Pay attention to this closely. Our new foreign policy priorities. And what she said was, Canada needs hard power, using actually the exact same language Trump had used that spring, hard power to support the global order, and she called for more military spending. The next day, our Minister of National Defence stood up in the House of Commons and he released Canada's new defence policy called Strong, Secure and Engage. This is Canada's defence policy. We are going to be spending a minimum of $553 billion on the military over the next 20 years to maintain high-end warfighting. There was no political dissent at all. Not one member of parliament, not one political party challenged this, expressed any criticism. And in fact, the NDP said that this wasn't enough, that it should be higher. The Green Party said nothing, and silence is acquiescence. So let's look a little bit more closely at Canada's defence policy. This is it here. So it's motivated by our relationship with NATO and our most important strategic relationship, the United States. We are going to increase the base budget of national defense. We are going to be building more warships than Harper wanted under the Conservatives. 15 warships at a cost of $104 billion. We're going to be buying more fighter jets than Harper wanted. 88 new fighter jets at a cost of at least $40 billion. This is what the Parliamentary Budget Officer has estimated. We are going to be buying armed drones for the first time. We're going to be buying attack helicopters. We're going to be modernizing our submarines and our light armored vehicles. We're going to be recruiting more soldiers, and we're going to especially target women, First Nations communities, and ethnic minorities, and we're going to militarize education. There's a new about $2 billion IDEAS program that has been unrolling at all of the post-secondary institutions across the country to try to partner with academics on defense research. Now, you might have seen this news at the height of the summer in August, just before the election was called. The Liberal government announced very quietly, without any competition, a sole source contract to buy 360 new light armored vehicles at the General Dynamics plant in London for a cost of $3 billion. That cost went up dramatically. Now, think about this for a moment. That $3 billion is equivalent to how much Canada is spending on the fossil fuel subsidies just for one defense purchase, one contract, $3 billion of our tax dollars. Now, have a look closely at this vehicle. I mean, I have written to the government to find out the specifications on the vehicle, what the fuel consumption is, to try to determine the carbon emissions of this. But these are the light armored vehicles that Canada uses across the country for training, and these are the light armored vehicles that Canada has sold in a $15 billion contract. These are the same vehicles that Canada sold to Saudi Arabia, and that we've been shipping hundreds of these light armored vehicles to this really repressive country that is engaged in this brutal war in Yemen, which is the worst humanitarian crisis. We are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And these are them. So these are, you can see, these are very, very heavy, energy inefficient. But the other thing is, these are really terrible for the forest, for wetlands, for soil erosion. These are terrible for the land, right? This is terrible for the land. And these are also the vehicles that Canada is training Latvian soldiers right now in Eastern Europe, as planning for a war against Russia. I mean, this is what we've sent over to Latvia, what we're training them for. So we're destroying the countryside of Eastern Europe with these Canadian-made vehicles. Now, what is the Canadian military doing with all of this funding, with all of this equipment? There is a misconception in Canada that we are peacekeepers. We actually haven't been doing peacekeeping seriously for the past 20 years. So I have been tracking the peacekeeping statistics that come from the United Nations Peacekeeping Office. Every single month, they track peacekeeping, the contribution that countries make to UN peacekeeping missions around the world. So I've been tracking this for 15 years. And you can see these are the latest statistics. Canada is ranked 72 with 49 soldiers wearing blue helmets, and the most powerful military on the planet is ranked 81st with a paltry 31 soldiers wearing blue helmets. Canada and the United States, the most well-financed, well-armed militaries in the world, are not doing peacekeeping. It is the poor developing countries, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, that are doing peacekeeping. So what are we doing? What are we doing? What we are doing is we are doing war planning, and we are doing war making, and we are doing war fighting. So let's just review the record very quickly over the past 15 years. So in 2004, Canadian Special Forces overthrew the democratically elected, beloved government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti. Canada was the country that led the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011 that totally devastated Libya and led to a mass refugee crisis from across North Africa and the Mediterranean. Canada was involved in a 12-year brutal war in Afghanistan. We are complicit in torture, and we are refusing to turn over documents to the International Criminal Court about our complicity in that torture. There was a report in 2015 that showed that the Canadian military is rife with sexual violence against women in uniform. Canada's selling arms not only to Saudi Arabia, but to Israel, to Egypt, to Bahrain. We are in the top 25 arms dealers in the world. Canada is refusing to join the UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, the worst weapons of mass destruction. Because of our membership in NATO, Canada is leading battle groups in Latvia and Poland right on Russia's border. We're the ones that are provoking conflict with Russia. Canada has secret forces that are operating with US AFRICOM on the African continent, in the Middle East, with no parliamentary and public oversight. We are constantly engaging in war exercises with NATO in the Baltics, right on Russia's border. So, considering the military emissions, considering the military expenditures, and considering what the Canadian military is doing with all of this war fighting, and considering our concern about the climate emergency, we are faced with some very difficult questions that we need to contend with. Why is it that we are spending so much money on militarized security and so little for environmental security to protect our life support system? How much of this remaining carbon budget of approximately 420 gigatons are we going to allot to Canada and the United States so that we can continue buying all of these weapons and fighter jets and warships and light armored vehicles for warfighting? How much of this remaining precious fuel are we going to use for warfighting instead of the just transition? How can we possibly talk about climate equity and justice when we are allowing our country to be engaged in this kind of militarism that's so carbon polluting? And why will none of the political parties deal with this? So I want to just bring to your attention, in case you didn't read, this is the NDP election platform. And you should be aware of this because I know many of you will be working with political parties, and rightly so. Okay, so what did the NDP say about all of this? Well, it's right at the end of their election platform. Up there at the top, the Canadian military is responsible for an incredibly important role. We are proud. We are contributing to a more stable and peaceful world through our operations abroad. Really? Really? We will make sure, the NDP will make sure that our troops have the equipment, training, and support they need to do their difficult work. We are going to make sure that we do the shipbuilding procurement. Oh, that's code for it. Let me just explain. Shipbuilding is actually warship building. What we're building in Halifax are combat vessels and armed Arctic offshore patrol boats. We are building warships. These are not the Blue Nose. It's warships. So we're building warships, and we are going to have, this is a lie, a fair competition for the fighter jet replacement. For the past 20 years, the Canadian government has spent $500 million to Lockheed Martin just to stay in the running to be able to buy the F-35s. We will buy the F-35s. It will not be an honest competition, and it will be the Lockheed Martin because we've already sunk nearly $1 billion into that. So that's the NDP. Now, let's see what the Greens say about this. Okay. The Green Party understands that the Canadian Armed Forces personnel are appreciated worldwide for their degree of training, quality leadership at all levels, and a can-do and cooperative attitude that they bring to international operations. Let's be honest, folks. Let's be honest. This is not true. Then, at this point, we are going to ensure a consistent capital investment plan with stable funding so that the service personnel have the equipment and training they need to fulfill an extended mandate. I forgot the other important point. Look at that, the third line. Canada needs a general purpose, combat-capable military. This is the Green Party that supposedly has a principle of nonviolence embedded in their constitution. This is totally antithetical to their values. And I think if any of you are a member of the Green Party, this should be challenged and this should be denounced. And then this point, which I think is almost the most dangerous, normalize the deployment of military personnel to protect civilians and communities from extreme forest fires and flooding. There is no role for the military for any of this. If we are having a forest fire, we need firefighters. We don't need the military. They're actually not trained for that. They're trained for combat. This is extremely dangerous. They are militarizing the response to climate change. I mean, just think, the institution that emits the most fossil fuels is now going to be in charge for responding to the climate crisis. This should be challenged. I am not a member of any political party, but I am appealing to you, to those of you who may be involved in a political party, to announce this. Now, I do have to say that the Green Party, unlike the NDP, do have a couple of good points. They do say that they will sign and ratify the treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. They will ban autonomous weapons, and they would end the contract to Saudi Arabia. So those are good things. But there are things in the NDP and the Green Party election platforms that are extremely dangerous and disconcerting, and that they need to be challenged. So, in closing, this is a quote from Daryl Copeland. There are no military solutions to the most profound problems that are imperiling the planet. It must be diplomacy. There is no reason for us to have a military. I am convinced that the research leads us to this essential point, that we must demilitarize and disarm for climate justice. We need a parallel process of climate mitigation and adaptation with a parallel process of disarmament and demilitarization if we are going to be honest about the climate science and if we're going to be honest about climate justice. Now, some hope for peace, conversion, and disarmament. When I was living in the UK from 2013 to 2015, I got involved in an organization called CAT, Campaign Against the Arms Trade. They produced this exceptional report called Arms to Renewables, looking at how these defense manufacturers in the United Kingdom could be converted to producing renewable energy technologies. And it's excellent. I think we need a study like that in Canada and the United States. Greenpeace jobs, not soldiers, and arms manufacturers. Some of you might be aware of the great example of Costa Rica that abolished its military 70 years ago, and its climate delegation has said in interviews that Costa Rica's history and experience with disarmament and demilitarization has paved the way for it to be the country to announce being the first to decarbonize. So they have a plan to be carbon-free and plastic-free. And they also are a country that almost run their electricity system over the course of the entire year on renewable energies. And they've shown great environmental leadership on environmental protection. It's not a perfect country, but there's definitely an example here. There's a fantastic movie about this called A Bold Peace, Costa Rica's Path to Demilitarization. The organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we've screened the film. We think it's really important, and I'd be happy to screen the film for Extinction Rebellion. So Costa Rica is a great example, and there's a film and information about that. A few years ago, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have this little campaign. It's with our banners that I brought tonight, and I'm hoping we can take a group picture with, that says demilitarize, decarbonize, stop the wars, stop the warming. And these are the banners that we bring to the climate actions and the climate strikes. You might have seen this in Toronto, for instance. And then an event that I would like to invite you to is May 2020 in Ottawa. We are going to have a big protest to shut down CANSEC. That's the big arms show. In fact, it's the largest weapons show in North America, called CANSEC, where all of the weapons manufacturers are selling their fighter jets and their light armored vehicles and their machine guns. So we're going to shut down CANSEC, and then we're going to have a peace conference and an action on Parliament Hill, and there's really fantastic speakers that are coming from all over the world. So come and join us. And Extinction Rebellion in Ottawa is helping us with an action, so we would love for you to take the train up and come and help us, because we really need to work together with the environmental movement and the peace movement, because that's what's going to take to try to stop this climate crisis. And then these are some other ideas for actions. We can talk about this more in the Q&A about what we can do, but I just urge you to, show this handout to your member of parliament, to make copies and take it to meetings and pass this out. When people say there isn't any money for the climate crisis, like the climate resiliency officer here in Toronto said, all of our municipalities are dying for resources to take action in the urban environment for climate change. Well, there is money. It's going to the military, and it shouldn't be going there. So I also want you to make sure that you totally oppose NATO. NATO is not our friend. NATO is a massive threat to, NATO does not help us with our security. It is actually causing climate insecurity.